Hi everyone, it's Lori, and I thought in this video series I would walk you through some basics of using Photoshop. I get asked all the time about Photoshop, and I know it is such a large program, and you have to remember Photoshop was built and is primarily used by graphic designers. It's also an amazing tool for photographers, but it can be a little bit overwhelming. So I'm going to do a series of videos walking you through some of my favorite tools that I use in Photoshop as a photographer, and I hope to make them easy for you to learn and utilize in your photography. So today we're going to get started with the very basic foundational element of layers and masking. So let's get started. Okay, so I have this image here opened in Photoshop, and you'll see that it opens it and places it as a background layer. And it's always going to have your image that you've brought in, and it's going to be your background. What I like to do is I do not like to work off of this original image. So I always keep my background so that I have my static image, the image that I brought in, the way that it was. This is helpful in case you need to redo something and it just leaves that original image alone. So what we want to do is duplicate this layer so that we can begin working on our image. So there's several ways to do that. You can right click and do duplicate layer. You can also do Command or Control J. The other thing that's important to note is you can double click on the words layer and you can rename it. So if we were going to add blur to this, if we were going to do cleanup, sometimes it's helpful if you're going to do a lot of layers and a lot of edits to rename them. So just wanted to make sure you knew that was available. All right, so that's usually the first step that I do. It's kind of an automatic, just so I know I've got that layer, and that gives me 2 copies of my image. Now for this video, we're going to be focusing on how to mask. And so I think the easiest thing to do is I am going to bring in a texture, and this will allow us to overlay the texture and show you how to use the mask features. So I'm going to go over to my files, and I keep my textures in a external file drive, and I'm going to just grab one. Let's grab this spring one. I'm going to drag it over. And now I'm going to place it on top of my image and click the checkbox, and we'll see now we have our third layer. So we have the texture that we've brought in, and I can turn it on and off, and it is over top. So how I like to explain this is if you think about these layers as sheets of paper. So we have a printed piece of paper with our image on it. Then we've laid on top of it another copy of our image. And now we've put a piece of paper on top that is like a piece of textured canvas. It's a piece of scrapbook paper, and it is solid, so you can't see through this paper. So at this point, we need to find a way to see our image underneath. And to do that, we're going to use the mask tools. So to apply the mask, we're going to come down, and you'll see at the bottom of your screen this little square box with a circle in the middle. It's right on the bottom right corner. We're going to click Add Layer Mask. And this is going to add the mask directly next to the image or the file that we've placed here. So next to our texture, we now have this layer mask. Now the layer mask thumbnail is going to open as white, and white is going to allow us, it's basically giving us a magic tool that's going to allow us when we use the brush to reveal what is underneath. So when you think about your stacks again, your sheets of paper, this is going to allow us to bring back and be able to see that layer underneath. So we need to come over, we need to make sure that we have black selected as our color. So there's a little arrow here where you can flip between black and white. If for some reason you're on a color, you can double click and you can get back to black. So what we want to do is make sure that we're on black, which is the opposite of our white mask. And then we're going to grab our brush tool. Now, when you open your brush tool, you can come up here to the top, and I like to make sure I'm on a soft round. That's just going to allow us to get a really soft brush as we're stroking with our brush. You can also use some others if you are working artistically and are comfortable using the other brushes. For our flow, I like to keep it around 50%. And then opacity, I'm going to start, we'll go ahead and start at 100% so that I can show you what happens. All right, to increase our brush size, you can use your bracket keys on your keyboard. I'm going to go ahead and do a large circle so that I can show you how this works. So we have our white mask and we're using a black brush, and it's basically going to allow us to paint directly and reveal what's underneath the mask texture that we added. So you can see it brings back 100% of what is underneath. It's almost like an eraser erasing that texture off. Now, of course, we don't want our image to look like this. So there's a couple other things that we can do, but the first step is to make sure that we just understand how the masks work. So you can see how that completely erased it at the 100% opacity. Now, if you make a mistake and you want to bring back some of the texture, or you want to mask something back on, you just flip your brush to white. And now we have white on white, which is going to bring back our texture. So I'm going to bring it all the way back. All right, so again, when you add your mask, it's going to be white. We're going to use black to reveal what's underneath, and we can flip it back to white to hide. So I'm going to hide it. All right, so that's the first step in masking. Now there's some other steps and some other ways to navigate this process. What I want to do now is show you a second way to mask, and that is if you bring up, let's just go ahead and we are going to delete this layer mask, and we're going to start from scratch. So we've already added our texture. Now we're going to come down and add that layer mask, but now I'm going to invert it. So I'm going to do Command or Control I, and I'm going to invert it to a black mask. So what that's done is it has hidden our texture layer. So we can't see it anymore. So now we need to come over and we need to use our white mask with our brush to bring back the texture. So some people prefer to mask this way. They like to choose what they're adding or bringing into their image. So you can see I can just bring back all of that texture. And then if I make a mistake, I can flip it to black and I can come in and bring back out those details. Okay, so that is doing the flip where we reversed our mask and we flipped it in this scenario. All right, so I'm going to delete that as well. So now that we've covered just the basics of how the mask works, I want to give you a little bit more technique on masking to help you, especially if you're doing something like adding textures. So there are lots of ways to really ensure that your mask looks natural and beautiful. So what we want to do first is I want to make sure you know when you bring something else into Photoshop, you can change your blend modes. So we could make this soft light where it's barely visible. We could do overlay. Could also do screen. We can do darken, multiply. There's all kinds of blend modes that are going to help us as we edit our image. We can also do lighter color. They're fun to play with. Now I'm going to keep it on normal, but what I'm going to do is reduce the opacity. And I'm going to take it down maybe to about 40%. I think that looks pretty nice. Now I'm going to add that layer mask. And for this example, I'm going to go ahead and keep it on white, which means that I can use a black brush to reveal what's underneath. So in this instance, I want to bring back more of the flower, And I'm going to reduce my brush size using, again, my bracket key. And I'm going to start just bringing back this detail. Now, always double check. So right now my opacity is at 100%. And that's fine because I want to bring back this detail. But now I'm going to take my brush opacity. I'm not changing my layer opacity. I'm coming over and I'm going to reduce the opacity of my brush to about 50%. And now I'm going to work on this stem because I want it to look natural and I don't need it at 100%. And then I'm going to start feathering around the petals. And I can make my brush even smaller to come around the edges. And just work the brush in the details. So that is a way to really tweak and customize as you're adding the texture. Now, one finishing step that I like to do is I'll flip it to white, the brush to white, because remember, white is going to bring back what's on this layer, which is our texture. And I'm just going to come around these edges and make sure that the edges don't have like a line around them and that it looks really natural. So that is how I would work with a texture that I've added to this image to make it look really natural using my mask and my white and my black paint to hide and reveal. You can also come around this edge. You always want to check your lines when you do that. Okay, so I'm going to hide this layer now, and I'm going to go back to that layer number 1 where we duplicated our background. And I'm going to show you some additional ways to use the mask features. So let's imagine that I want to add a little bit of, let's add some blur to this image. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, and I'm going to add a Gaussian blur. This is a really nice one that gives a real soft background and a nice textured look to your image. So I'm going to increase it pretty heavily and click OK. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this just so that we remember that this is our blur filter. Okay, so we've got this added now, and it's at 100% opacity. And what I'm going to do next is add that mask. And so I've added, the mask is white, and to reveal the detail underneath, I'm going to need to go to my black paint with my brush and then think about my opacity. And I think I'll start at 50%. I'm going to use my bracket key to enlarge my brush, and I'm going to just start real gently bringing out the details and then make my brush smaller as I go around the edges. This is if I wanted to create a really artistic look with this image. Now, if I want more detail at the top, I can raise the opacity of my brush. Always remember your brush tools are up at the top of your menu. Now, my system is set up with the photography menu. And so if yours looks different, that may be the case. If you go to Window, Workspace, there are several options. And I run my Photoshop on the photography setting. So we can just continue to come in and use our brush tools to bring back some detail. So if I show you the before, there's the full flower with the background, and here's the after with that blur effect. And then we could decide if we wanted to bring back some more detail right here, kind of come down the flower. And so that's another way to use the beauty of the mask tools. Okay, so let's delete this one. And I am going to rename this, and let's do oil paint. So I'm going to show you one more example. And actually, because we modified this layer, we can't just change the title of that because we worked on this layer. So what I'm going to do is actually trash that because I don't need it. Now I'm back to my background, and I'm going to duplicate it again. So Command or Control J to give us that background. Now I'm going to rename it oil paint. So when you think about your layers, if you do something to this layer, it is then changed. So if you decide you don't want it, you can turn it off. You can turn it back on. You can also delete it. You could also go in your history and go backwards, but I think it's best to work within your layers. And that's the other reason that I always keep a background copy of my image, because you can always go and duplicate that background at any point. All right, so let's go up to filter, other, filter, stylize, oil paint. And for this, I'm going to keep all my stylization, all of these brush details over to the right. And then the lighting, I'm going to increase it just a little bit and maybe bring the stylization back down. And we can zoom out on our image a little bit, maybe zoom in right here to see what it looks like. So I'm going to make that kind of heavy so that you can see it on your screen at home. Okay, click OK. And so if I zoom in and we turn this on and off, you should be able to see that oil paint. And now if I want to alter where that oil paint is applied, I can go down to add my layer mask. Now for this image, I don't really want it on the background. So what I'm going to do is actually invert. So Command or Control I. I could also, that's going to be the easiest way for you to get to the inversion. And so now that we have it as black, I can't see that oil paint. So now it's gone. So what I'm going to do is make sure I'm on white, grab my brush, and I think I want about maybe a 50% opacity. And I'm going to come back and apply it just on the flower and on these petals to give it a little bit of that paint look. And I can continue to modify my opacity if I decide I want some more. It's best to start a little soft, and then you can always increase it. So this is a nice way to just add a little bit of that oil paint. So we hid the oil paint and now we've added it. Now, once I've done this and I decide maybe I want some in the background, but I want it at a really low opacity. So I can bring down my brush opacity, maybe to about 20 some percent. I'm going to increase my brush, and now I can just brush that on all over the image really gently. And if I decide I like it, I can take it maybe up to about 40%. Now we can see a little bit more of that texture. I'm going to zoom in so you can see it where you are. So if we zoom in over here, you should be able to see just a little bit of that texture added. It's just really, really soft versus what's on the flower. So if I show you before and after, it's very subtle. But that's one way that you can really customize your images using the mask tools. So I hope you'll play around with mask. I encourage you to take an image like I have, add a texture or play with some of the filters and just work with your mask. It takes some practice to get used to using the black or the white paint, your brush, and changing your opacities to really get the look that you're going for. I have some additional videos on masking with textures and other options in the Photoshop library collection. So I hope you'll check those out and send me any comments or messages if you have any other ideas about masking or questions that I can help you with. Thanks, everyone.